When you're ready to epoxy your guides, I prefer to use the Flex Coat syringes. Just quick, easy, clean, and a precise way to measure your epoxy. Again, it's a two-part epoxy. You want to measure them 50 to 50, or 1 to 1 rather. And I'm going to mix about 3 cc's of each part. I'll go ahead and make it 4, just to be safe. The more you mix, the more room for error you have, meaning that, because your ratios are not going to be exact. So I double checked my syringes ahead of time. Both had 12 milliliters of epoxy. And I already squoze part B in there, 4 milliliters. Part A, I'm going to do 4 as well. So 12 down to 8 right here. Just like that. Set those aside. You can do them just as well from the bottles, squeeze them in and watch them as you go. Just make sure you're mixing plenty of epoxy to avoid any mistakes and your ratios being off. Now all I'm going to do is take some mixing stick, stick it in my epoxy, and stir. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to pull the stick in and out or get crazy going too fast. What happens is you pull in bubbles. You'll still get some bubbles doing it this way, but ultimately you want to try to avoid it. And just stir nice and easy. You'll see that the epoxy got cloudy here. We're going to keep mixing it. It's going to get clear. And then cloudy. And then clear again. We want to make sure that every ounce of the epoxy, all the way around the walls, all the way on the bottom, gets mixed. So we have no swirls in there. It takes some time, but it's really important. And one thing I'll do, if I know I'm only mixing a few or a little bit of epoxy, and I don't have too much time to wait for the epoxy to set up, or if it's cold out, I'll take my alcohol burner and hold my epoxy just above it so it makes the epoxy lukewarm. Not even lukewarm, just maybe just barely above room temperature. If you heat it, the more you heat it, the faster your reaction is going to take place and the less pot life you'll have. The epoxy will set up a lot quicker. Now, if you want to thin your epoxy and not have it react as fast, the right way to do it is to heat each individual part separately. And you can do that a couple ways. Like if you want to take this, wrap it in a warm cloth, or lightly heat this over your alcohol burner. By slightly warming your epoxy, it will thin a little bit, which will help it mix together. The two parts come together as one. Okay, that looks good. We're going to take our mixer. We don't need this flame burning anymore right now. I double check before I put my rod in here that my guides are straight. And now all I'm going to do is take a brush and apply the epoxy. When applying the epoxy, it's just nice and easy. Right? I want to make sure I get it up in the gaps where my wraps meet my guide feet. So I seal that thread, and no water, especially salt water, can get up in there and corrode the guide from underneath the foot. I want to make sure we get it in those gaps. That's the most important part. And again, you can do this by hand, going real slow. I prefer to do it with the foot pedal on my power wrapper, just like so. Apply a nice thin finish. And you can epoxy a rod in no time like that, obviously. Again, just a real light coat of epoxy. And depending on the type of rod, this here is a 9-weight fly rod. I'm sorry, 8-weight fly rod. It's 9 feet long. I'm going to put one real thin coat, let it cure, come back and put a second coat. You can try to get it all in one coat. I prefer 2 nice thin coats. Or on a heavy offshore rod, possibly 3 thin coats. All depends. That looks good. All right. I'll show you another way to get some epoxy on there. I'm going to switch with on my rod wrapper here. I'm going to switch motors. I'm going to take the belt off of my wrapping motor and put it on my drying motor. And then switch my wrapper to dry. And it's a constant, slow RPM, slowly rotating motor that will keep the epoxy level and help it epoxy level itself. Now, if you're new to rod building and you're epoxying your first few rods, having the rod spin on its own like this can really make it easy and less frustrating. You've got both hands free. You're not spinning the blank by your hand. You're not having to worry about keep the blank rotating as you fluctuate the speed with a foot pedal or anything like that. It's just a constant rotation. Obviously, it's a little slower, but again, especially starting out, it just kind of alleviates the headaches of having to spin the blank and make sure that you're covering up your wraps at the same time that you're making sure it's rotating and not sagging. I'm going to show you again the way I prefer to do it. Just put it on my wrapping motor, just like that. Just a drop of epoxy. Again, making sure we get the epoxy up on the foot where it meets the thread. All right, that looks good. Now, once we have all our guides wrapped, this is only the one piece of a 2-piece fly rod. I'm going to epoxy it one section at a time. I'm going to go ahead and switch it back to the drying motor and let it cure like that. That way the epoxy will level itself out, there's no sags, and it'll cure nice and level. Now before I go ahead and let it sit overnight, or for a good 12 hours, I'm going to go ahead and take my alcohol burner, and if I have any bubbles in the wraps, I'll just lightly put the flame under them and let the heat from the flame come off and get the wrap, or get the bubbles. I'm not touching the wrap with the flame. I'm just letting the heat build up and break the surface tension so those bubbles can get out. Now, if you don't have bubbles in your wraps, you don't need to flame them at all. I like to give it a little bit of a flame just to make sure those bubbles are out, and then we'll let it sit. And I'll come back in a couple hours and double check to make sure no bubbles haven't collected. They'll usually collect right where the guide feet come into the thread. Let that dry overnight, and we'll have a finished rod.